It's Create Day, my friends. Let's turn some thrift store finds into French country farmhouse decor for the kitchen. Welcome to my channel. Let's get started. I'm going to be using this little metal galvanized bucket or vase. I actually got this from Michael's. This was not a thrift find. I got it on clearance and I've had it in my home for several years now, so I wanted to give it a makeover. I also have a wood rolling pin and then several different wooden utensils. The little silver pie scooper thing, I can't remember what it's called. I end up not using that one. I just use the wooden spoons and spatula. I'm starting with the galvanized metal bucket, and I'm using Dixie Belle's mineral chalk paint in the color Palmetto. I will do 3 coats of this to get good coverage over the entire bucket. Once that was good and dry, I gave this a coat of my clear matte sealer. The next step I'll be using a lot of water in the painting technique, so I wanted to make sure that I wouldn't reactivate that chalk paint. I'm mixing some white chalk paint into that original Palmetto color just to get a lighter version of that color. So now I'm going to take that lighter version and brush this on my bucket and mist it with my water mister to get it to just kind of run down. And what I should have done was actually mist my bucket first. So I remembered that I hadn't done that. So I go ahead and mist it and then I start again. Just liberally applying that lighter color and applying the water with my mister, letting it run down. I use puppy pads when I do a process like this so it can capture all that water. And I just want it to give this more of an aged look. So it's just one of those things where you just have to, paint it, mist it, see how it runs, and then just kind of move on to the next section. And then once it dries, you can tell if you've got enough on there or if you need to add more. It just depends on the look you're going for. I was just trying to give this kind of a weathered look. And this is a real easy way to do it. It's messy, but it's easy. I ended up doing this process twice around the entire piece. I let it dry in between and then did it a second time, and I could have done it a third time. I think I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, but I think I would have liked it to have been just a little bit more weathered looking. So here's how it looks after the first go around, and I'm just going to go ahead and do it a second time. Now for the top portion of this, I did not want to run that water all down into the inside of this. So I just brushed on that paint and I took a wet rag and just dabbed off, the excess paint so that it would have a similar effect as the outside of the bucket. Now I'm going to do some splatters. So I'm using Espresso bean and deep gray. And then I also have a custom color I mixed up using my white chalk paint and just a little bit of Dixie Belle's chalk mineral paint in the color Putty. I have all 3 of these colors on my plate. I'm going to add some water from my mister, and I like to use a fan brush for this effect. That's what works best for me. But it really does make quite the mess. Even though I have this puppy pad down, I ended up with splatters all over my wall and stuff on my desk. Anyway, I just water down that paint, get it on the brush, and I use another paintbrush handle to tap this all over. I'm going in with the brown first, and then this color is the deep gray, And then lastly, I will do my little off-white color that I made up. I repeat this process around the entire bucket, including the top rim. When that's dry, I go in with another coat of my matte sealer. I want to make a label for the front of this bucket, so I'm using IOD's Crockery Stamp. I've not used these stamps before, so I am priming them by rubbing some fine grit sandpaper over the labels. You go one direction and then the other, and this is the stamp I'm going to be using. And I'm going to use my Stays On ink in Timber Brown. I ink the stamp, I'm doing this on Dropcloth, so I ink up the stamp more than I would if it was just on a regular flat surface because it will really soak into that fabric. And you just want to spend some time pressing it down, hold it longer than you usually would on a, like on a hard surface. And this one turned out really well. And now I'm using that same Stays On ink in Timber Brown, and I'm just using my little sponge dauber to go around the edges and add some aging to this piece of drop cloth. I'm using Fabri-Tac to attach my label to the front of my bucket. And I will leave a list of all the items I've used in this video down in the description box. I smoothed it down with my fingers, but then I got a stiff brush and rubbed it over to make sure it was adhered in all those little grooves on the front of the bucket. And no label would be complete without some embellishments. So I have these little brads from, it's the Paper Studio, and these are like a antique bronze finish. I'm pulling those little end pieces apart so that I can just snip them off with the little tool I have is actually for cutting off the backs of buttons. And that worked pretty good for these. And they're, hollow in the middle. So I'm going to have to fill them with glue. I'm using E6000. I have a paper towel wrapped around it because it sprung a leak and I was getting glue all over my fingers. And I'm sorry, most of this is like not in frame, but all I'm doing is filling that center of that little brad with the E6000 so that I can attach it down onto my label. I thought about using hot glue, but I was afraid that it wouldn't stick long term onto that metal brad. But they are on there for life now with that E6000. It works really well for stuff like this. And with that, this little bucket is done. Next up is our rolling pin, and I am painting the handles that same green color from Dixie Belle called Palmetto. I did one coat and let it dry, but when I did the second coat, I went in immediately with that mixture I had made up with the Palmetto and my white chalk paint, and I just blended that right into that already wet green color, and it just gave it a really nice effect. It made it look more kind of vintage and worn just by having those two different colors mixed in there. This is where I'm doing the process on the other handle. I've got that green paint on there, and immediately I go in with a lighter color. I thought I wanted to paint this with my white chalk paint. This is Cottage White by Folk Art, but it ended up being just too bright, so I took that paint and I added just that drop of Dixie Belle's Putty, and I used this on the previous project to do the splatters on my bucket. So I decided to go ahead and paint this that color. It just toned it down a little bit, more of just, it's still white, but it's like an off-white. It just doesn't have that really bright white to it. I wanted it to be a little more fitting with what I was doing with the other projects. So here I'm just going very carefully around that beveled edge at the end of the rolling pin. Now it's time for transfers. I'm using these roses from IOD's Ephemeral Melange. And the first thing I want to do is cut off all the typography. I'm going to be cutting this one into pieces so that I can spread it around on that rolling pin instead of just putting this on there in one piece. And I will be saving all of these for a future project. So I go ahead and cut out the roses just so that I can lay them out separately. There's no specific way to do it. I was just trying to figure out where I could cut it so that it would fit nicely onto my rolling pin. Even though people do this all the time, it still makes me really nervous. I never know if I'm cutting in the right place. So now I'm going to go ahead and add my first transfer. And I'm just going to use the little transfer stick and rub this on and carefully peel back that transfer sheet, making sure that every little piece of that transfer is on there before I remove it. Then I burnish it with that transfer sheet just to make sure it's adhered really well. I'm going to repeat this process with the rest of my roses. Now for this part, I wanted that leaf to be underneath the rose, so I had to position it and then rub the leaf on first and then put the rose over the top of it. So I'm just trying to line it up where I want it to be, and then I'm going to slip that leaf under there and figure out where I want that, and then I can hold that down, remove the rose, and then transfer on the leaf first, and then go back with the rose. Now this transfer is from IOD's Brocante transfer set, and I thought that would look really nice right there along the bottom of the roses. So I'm just going to go ahead and attach that to the rolling pin. I'm absolutely loving how this is turning out, but I did want to add a little distressing to my transfers. So I have some 220 grit sandpaper, and I'm going over this with a really light touch. It does not take much. It scratches them up pretty easily so that they will look more vintage and aged. Using that same sandpaper, I distress that beveled edge on the ends of the rolling pin, and then I go in and add a little distressing on the handles. Now I'm applying a coat of my clear matte sealer so that I can go in with some Dixie Belle glaze. I'm using Van Dyke Brown. I will brush this onto the handles and around the end of the rolling pin and then just wipe it off with a cloth. Depending on your surface, you might want to use a baby wipe as I did with the end of the rolling pin here, because it was just on that bare wood. Even though it had been sealed, it just stuck a lot better than it did on the painted areas. So now I'm going to take that same glaze and I'm just streaking it lightly across my rolling pin and wiping it back with a baby wipe. It just gives a little bit of age to it without making it look completely dirty. Once that was dry, I went in with one more of my clear coat matte, and that was it for this project. I absolutely love how this turned out. Last up is our little set of wooden utensils. Everybody's getting a coat of clear sealer just to help block some of that stain. Even though I cleaned these really well, they just needed to have a somewhat of a coat of stain blocker on there. And now I'm painting the inside of the spoons with my white chalk paint. The spatula is getting a coat of my custom color made with Palmetto and my white chalk paint, and I will also use this on the backs and handles of the spoons. Now I want to do some decoupage on the insides of those spoons, and I have these really pretty papers I got from Amazon, but they're a little bit thick for decoupage, so I'm going to use this hack that I saw from Deidre at Our Upcycled Life, where you put packing tape on the back of the paper, completely covering it and rubbing it down nice and firmly, and then when you peel that tape off, it removes a layer of that paper, so the part you want to use for decoupage is a lot thinner, and so it works a lot better. So now I have all my tape on there and I'm going to start peeling this back. This is the first time I've ever done this, so I was really curious and it totally worked. Look at all that paper it took off, and now my sheet, it's not like tissue paper by any means, but it is definitely thinner. So I'm just going to go ahead and trace around so I have a general idea of where I need to cut, and then I can decoupage that on, and I will be sanding off the edges, so this doesn't need to line up perfectly. So I'm just going to go ahead and apply these with my matte Mod Podge. I smooth out the wrinkles the best that I can, and then I set these aside to dry. For the spatula, I'm going to use a couple of stamps. I'm using this rose from the IOD's Antiquities Stamp, and then a script stamp, and I'm going to do this in my Stays on Ink in Timber Brown. I'm doing the rose first, and then I'm going to mask it off and do the script stamp over it so it will look like the script stamp is actually behind it. So here's the mask that came with that Antiquities stamp. I'm placing that over there. And the mistake I made is this script stamp is on a solid acrylic block, and my spatula is not completely flat. So this actually did not work well at all. And I needed to take it off the acrylic block and then just use it with a regular thin mount so that I could kind of wrap this around the curvature in that spatula. And you can see I used a little piece of painter's tape to help hold that mask in place. I was just afraid it was going to move on me. So I just taped it down in one spot. And then when I went to do the bottom half, I just moved the tape up to the top portion and just stamped up the bottom of this. And here I'm just adding a little bit more on the very bottom. Now that our Mod Podge is all dry, I'm trimming off the excess, and then I'm going in with my sanding block, just in a downward motion on the edges of the spoon to remove the excess paper. And then around that bottom part there where I can't really do the sandpaper or take all the paint off, I just rip it off with my fingers. Then I do a little touch up with the paint because there was a little bit of the white paint showing through. And then when that's dry, I can do a final coat of Mod Podge on top. Once that was dry, it's time for wax. I'm starting with clear wax, and I'm going to go over all the spoons and the spatula. I wipe that back with a rag, and then I can go in with my dark wax. I start around the edges, and I just kind of work my way down the handle, just kind of trying to stay on the edges with only doing a little bit on the front part of that spoon and on the back. I don't want to completely cover this. I just want to give a little bit of aging to it. And here's where I'm doing the clear wax on the spatula and then wiping it back. And then I'm going in with the antiquing wax on the edges of that as well. So now it's time for some white wax to lighten things up a little bit. The antique wax really did kind of change the color, and I wanted to bring it back to its more original state. So I'm going to brush the white wax all over the spoons and the spatula and then wipe it back. Hopefully you can see here the difference between the two. The one on the right is the white wax and the one on the left isn't. And then I hadn't originally put the wax on that decoupaged paper, but I decided to go ahead and try that to see how it looked. And it did soften it up a little bit. So I really like that. And here's the difference between those two. So here I'm doing the white wax on the spatula, and what I wanted to show you is when I did it on the front where the stamp is, it turned purple. Like a previous project, it did that, and then it smeared, and so I was really nervous that this whole thing was going to be a big smeary mess. But I gently wiped that white wax off, and I realized that nope, it wasn't smearing. We're all good. I don't know why it turns purple, but it just does. But it's back to its original color, and it's fine once you get that all off of there. The last thing I did was tear up some tea towel and just tie strips around the spoons and the spatula. Just tied a knot and trim the edges, and these projects are done. Time to take a look at how everything turned out. Well, that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I hope I've inspired you to go create something. See you next time.